Hey everyone, welcome back to our channel. Today we are going to dive into a fascinating topic, the science behind painkillers. Have you ever wondered how these little pills can alleviate our pain so effectively? Let's uncover the mechanism behind these medications. But before we jump right into the specifics of painkillers, let's understand what pain really is. Pain is our body's way of signaling that something isn't right. In fact, it's a complex sensation involving our nerves, brain, and spinal cord. When we are injured or sick, certain chemicals are released by our tissues, which act as danger signals, and they activate pain receptors, which are specialized neurons which send signals to our brain to let us know that we might be in danger and we might have to get out of that situation. Furthermore, there are many different types of pain, such as chronic, acute, and neuropathic. And pain, interestingly, is highly subjective to each individual, and everyone experiences pain differently. Genetics, culture, and even our current mood or psychology impact how we perceive pain in the first place. Now let's talk about painkillers. But before talking about the exact mechanism of action of some of these drugs, let's talk about the broad categories that most painkillers fall into. Specifically, these medications work by interfering with the way our bodies perceive or process pain signals. There are different types of painkillers, but they generally fall into two main categories: non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs, also known as NSAIDs, and of course, as you might have guessed, opioids. NSAIDs, as the name suggests, work by reducing inflammation and signs of fever, and they also interfere with some of the danger signals or molecules that are released by the tissues. Interestingly, they also increase our pain threshold, allowing us to be in less discomfort. NSAIDs primarily act by inhibiting COX enzymes rather than inhibiting neurons themselves. So that's one of the major differences between NSAIDs and opioids, as we will soon learn. A famous example of NSAID that almost everyone has heard of is aspirin. Now let's talk about opioids. Opioids are very powerful painkillers, and the way that they work is that they bind to opioid receptors, causing action potentials of the neurons to be inhibited. Furthermore, opioid receptors, as you might have already known, are found in both the central nervous system, so the brain and the spinal cord, but also the peripheral nervous system. And of course, the digestive tract also has some opioid receptors. So when you take opioids, there might also be digestive side effects to your digestive system. A very famous example of an opioid is morphine. Now let's talk about how inflammation and pain are related. Usually what happens is the process starts by when you damage your tissue by, for example, touching a very hot object, and this damaged tissue releases danger signals or danger molecules to warn your brain to move your hand. Specifically, a very common danger signal or molecule is called arachidonic acid, and COX-1 and COX-2 isoenzymes that we talked about convert this arachidonic acid to prostaglandin H2. When this prostaglandin H2 gets formed, Its metabolites include, for example, PGE2 and a wide variety of other molecules, which are all involved in promoting inflammation and also activating the nociceptors or the pain neurons in the peripheral nervous system to send messages to the brain. Now we can start talking about the exact mechanism of action of, for example, one of the most common NSAIDs, which is aspirin. As we talked about NSAIDs, they work by inhibiting the COX-1 and COX-2 isoenzymes. Specifically, they work to disable or inhibit COX-1 and COX-2 in a variety of different ways. For example, for aspirin, what happens is aspirin binds to COX-1 or COX-2 enzymes, and upon binding, it breaks off and it leaves a very tiny piece of its protein or amino acid sequence in the COX-1 and COX-2 enzymes active site. And what happens is, from the diagram you can tell that the orange ball, which is arachidonic acid, can no longer bind to the COX-1 COX-2 active site. So arachidonic acid can no longer be converted to prostaglandin, which means that there will be no inflammation or reduced inflammation and reduced pain messengers getting picked up by the brain and the nociceptors present. Now let's talk about nociceptors and pain reception. Nociceptors, as the name suggests, are a type of sensory neuron that activate in response to danger stimuli. In fact, they help keep us safe by helping us avoid danger. A very interesting thing about these receptors is that their threshold actually changes depending on a wide variety of factors. For example, inflammation makes us more sensitive to pain. There is also many different types of nociceptors. For example, mechanical nociceptors help us detect pressure and touch stimuli, while chemical nociceptors help us detect danger molecules. Now let's talk in more detail about opioids. Opioids bind to opioid receptors, which are found in the digestive system and also the central and peripheral nervous system. Opioids are involved with emotions and pleasure, and while their exact mechanism of action is an active area of research, most scientists agree that opioids work by inhibiting GABAergic neurons in the brain, while they stimulate the ventral tegmental area, which activates the mesolimbic dopaminergic pathway, and this leads to dopamine being released, and this makes us feel euphoric and very happy. And the mesolimbic pathway is specifically involved in reward and pleasure, which is one of the reasons why it is very easy for us to become dependent on opioids, because of the activation of the mesolimbic pathway and the dopamine release. Unfortunately, since opioids are so highly addictive, many people have become dependent on them, and opioid addiction is very dangerous as it could cause respiratory failure. One drug that you should be aware of in case someone overdoses from opioids is called naloxone. And the way that naloxone works is that it reduces or contradicts the effects of opioids by by replacing or displacing the opioids from their receptors. And basically what happens is, from the diagram you can see the opioids being bound to the receptors, but when you inject naloxone into someone, the naloxone has a very high affinity for the opioid receptors, which causes the opioids to be displaced and the naloxone stays at the receptor instead. Another feature of naloxone is that it is highly lipophilic, which means that it can cross the blood-brain barrier rapidly, which is very important because we want this medication to work very quickly and in order to save lives. Thank you so much for watching this video. If you liked our video, please make sure to like and subscribe for more similar content in the future.